Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about a very ticklish subject, and that is English subtitles. A lot of people who advocate Japanese self-immersion, as I do, regard English subtitles as the devil, as something that you should never use under any circumstances. And I have certainly been somewhat critical of English subtitles. I put hazmat warnings on them, and I stand by that. But I don't necessarily think that they're something you should never use under any circumstances. I think they can have certain uses. So why do I think that? And why do I differ from the people who so strongly say that you should never use them? Now, the thing to understand here is that when somebody gives you a piece of advice, you have to understand the ecology behind that advice, the reasoning behind why it was given. Otherwise, you're going to end up following various random pieces of advice that don't necessarily fit into what it is that you're actually doing. For example, if you look up on the internet advice on preserving and maintaining batteries, and you read a lot of things about the best techniques for maintaining a lithium-ion battery, and what you've actually got is a nickel metal hydride battery, then these tips and techniques that you're learning may not be of any value to you. And it's the same with Japanese. Different pieces of advice fit into different contexts and make sense in those contexts, and not necessarily outside of them. So the people who say that you should never use English subtitles are usually, if they're people who understand the reasoning behind this advice, which isn't always a given, generally speaking, they are people whose techniques have at least been influenced by the Ajat Anti-Moon school of immersion. And this is a school that advocates learning Japanese fundamentally by immersion without studying the grammar structure, because the idea is to pick it up in something like the way a child picks it up intuitively. And I've talked about my views on this, and you can watch that video if you want to know my take on this. But that's not really what we're going to discuss today. The point about this is that if you are going to learn Japanese intuitively in this way, without any structure, or in some modified versions of it with only limited structure, but in the pure form, no structure at all, then English subtitles obviously don't make sense, and in fact would disrupt your intuitive process. Now, I've also given warnings about subtitles, but it's for slightly different reasons. Why do I think we should be very careful about English subtitles? Well, firstly, for the very obvious reason. The brain is lazy, or, if we want to put it another way, efficient. It wants to get the maximum input for the minimum output. That's the way it's programmed. That's the way it's wired. So if you start using English subtitles, the brain will take every opportunity to focus on the English subtitles, which it finds easy, and not on the Japanese, which it finds difficult. So in a worst case scenario, you're going to run the anime with English subtitles with some idea of listening to the Japanese, and your mind is just going to be drawn so heavily to those subtitles that you're really not going to learn anything at all. However, there's more to it than that. The second important point to understand is that English subtitles aren't accurate. By definition, they're not accurate. If they're professional subtitles, the job of the translator is not to render Japanese with pinpoint structural accuracy. Their job is to entertain people in English with something like the original anime script. If they're amateur translators, they may possibly stick closer to the Japanese, though that's by no means guaranteed. They're also a lot more likely to make actual mistakes. But the point is that whether we're actually localizing and making our characters talk like Americans when actually they were talking like Japanese people, or whether we're doing just those simple things like translating kohi ga suki da as I like coffee, and you know perfectly well why that's so wrong. If you don't, you should see my video on the subject. We're not going to be getting the actual structure of the Japanese, even in the best and most faithful subtitles. And the ones that are very faithful to the Japanese are relatively rare in any case. So, having said all that, why do I even countenance the idea of English subtitles? Why aren't I against them to the same degree as the Ajat-influenced schools? Well, because the organic ecology is different, it's not expecting you to learn Japanese by pure intuition. You're learning Japanese structurally, and then applying that to immersion. And of course, immersion is what actually teaches you Japanese. You don't learn Japanese from the structure. It's just an aid to make learning Japanese from immersion much easier. Because we're doing this, and in fact everybody cheats. Nobody is actually learning Japanese by pure intuition. Ajat allows English translations for the first 1,000 sentences, and it recommends doing the entirety of Heisig, learning kanji with English keywords, which I happen to think is a terrible idea, but that's again a subject for another video. Our cheat is learning structure, and because that's the cheat we allow the use of English to grasp the actual structure of Japanese. Now, Ajat couldn't even have done this because there was no way of learning structure until very recently. There was only the mess in the textbooks that gets called Japanese grammar. Because we are using structure, there's nothing inherently wrong within our ecology of using English subtitles if we use them only occasionally and very judiciously. How should we use them? When should we use them? Well, let me tell you that I started learning Japanese seriously through anime with Japanese subtitles, and most of the time I didn't even have any English subtitles. So you can certainly manage without them. And I would recommend doing so in the early stages because you don't want to get dependent on English subtitles and you don't want to start learning false analogies from subtitles. English subtitles are safest when you've got enough knowledge of Japanese to at least tell when they're leading you up the garden path. So when do we use them and how do we check them for being completely wrong? Well, when we should use them is when we're really stuck. That's the only time we need them. We need them when we look at a sentence, we look up any words we don't know, we parse the structure as best we can, and we're still not understanding what the sentence is driving at. Now, people vary a lot, as I've said before, in their level of linguistic intuition. I told the story about going to France with someone who knew much less French than I did, but was much better than me at grasping what was going on in a given situation, what people were trying to tell us. And that's because she had a high intuition, both linguistically and of the sort of things that humans are likely to say. Mine is very low because I'm not human. Yours may be somewhere in the middle. You may have very high intuition like my friend, you may have very low intuition like me, or you may have something somewhere in the middle. Most of the people who successfully learn through methods like Ajat, I would say, probably have very high intuition. So they can actually use this intuition-only method of grasping language. If you can't do that, I can't, then you need some extra help. If you're stuck, and if you look it up on the subtitles, the important thing then is to go back to the Japanese and re-examine it. Now, looking at the structure, looking at the words, and with that hint from the English subtitle, can you see how it fits together? Can you see how it's working now? If you can, then that's fine. When you listen again and again to the same soundtrack on your audio, you'll be consolidating this new piece of information. If you can't, if you still have no idea why the Japanese means what the English subtitle said it meant, then please take it with a pinch of salt. The subtitle may just be wrong. It may be an attempt at localization. Sometimes Japanese people say things that don't really have English equivalents, and then the translator is going to fill in with some piece of English blarney that happens to fit the situation. So if you can't see what's going on, don't take it on trust. But if you can see what's going on, if you can make some kind of sense of it, then the subtitles have actually helped you. And these are the kinds of situations where they can help you. This is going to be a pragmatic decision in every case. All I can do is warn you against the fact that subtitles may not be accurate and warn you against being drawn into them, sucked into the cogwheels of English subtitles that your brain is so anxious to escape into, away from the difficulty of parsing real Japanese. But English subtitles can help you. They can help you over tight spots. They can help you to see how particular combinations of words are used in particular circumstances with a particular meaning. And then when you encounter similar structures again and again in other anime, in other places, they'll start to form solid patterns in your brain independent of the English subtitles. As always, you have to make your own decisions in an intelligent manner, and I know you're capable of doing that. The main point of this video was first of all to dispel the idea that never being able to watch English subtitles is a universally applicable dictum. It's not. It belongs to a particular ecology. And second, to give you some idea of the principles on which you can use them, and a warning that you really need to treat them with extreme caution. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my Gold Kokeshi patrons who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. And I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.